I'm going to give an intro from behind.
Hi, thanks for coming, everybody. We're really excited to have Alex and Charlie here. Charlie's making a really dramatic entrance momentarily. Alex and Charlie are our good friends and both amazing writers and thinkers, and we're really excited to have the chance to restage this talk that was originally presented on Memorial Day, which was pretty inconvenient for most people. So, yeah, thanks Topos, thanks Annie, thanks everybody.
Thank you, yeah, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you Topos, thank you Lily Clark. So this is a talk about Jackass. Yes.
So can everyone hear us?
You have a little louder.
Okay. So we first started getting interested in this when we noticed a sort of rising resurgence of early aughts indie culture. So our friends were starting to listen to like the old indie rock they were into in high school, like The Fray, Modest Mouse, and the Garden State soundtrack. And we also noticed a renewed interest in like quote-unquote bad celebrities. So some like Lindsay Lohan and Britney Spears, who sort of had damaged careers because of like addiction or mental health stuff, or paparazzi, and others like Paris Hilton and Nicole Richie, who sort of represented the first crop of stars to come up with reality TV. And so they were, I guess, like bad in the sense that they were bad at doing anything other than being famous and garnering attention, but actually this skill would sort of get its full due with the advent of social media. And arguably Trump is a sort of bad celebrity on both counts. It's been enough time that 2003 culture has been canonized, and now it is available as a reference that is charged with meaning because of decades plus lapse has occurred.
And so for anyone who's not familiar with Jackass, it's a show that was on MTV. It kind of came out of skate video culture, and it was people doing stunts, and it's kind of like proto-viral video things, and people injuring themselves on camera in really inventive ways. Earlier this year, New York City-based film organization Screen Slate put out a Jackass Reader, which featured several essays exploring Jackass in the context of like performance art history, and also Bataille, of course. And more recently, Johnny Knoxville has a new film. Johnny Knoxville is one of the main Jackass guys. He had a new film come out recently called Action Point, so which is like been billed as like Jackass but even more intense. And so that kind of coincided with our interest in revisiting Jackass. Was one of the Jackasses themselves bringing it back. I don't know. There have also been a number of articles in like AV and Page 6 kind of doing like retrospective, like taking stock of what exactly happened with Jackass. An example headline is, "Jackass left a wake of pain, arrests, and addiction."
So we felt like this sort of post-election resurgence of 2000s culture, ranging from indie music to Jackass, was what we called an aesthetics of white impotence. And for us, this sort of stemmed from a loss of what Lauren Berlant has called the good life, which she defines as satisfying intimacy, political representation, and economic stability. So for some people, this means losing a dream that your parents had access to, whereas for others, like the Tide Pod generation, many of them didn't believe that they would have the good life in the first place. We were interested in the way this sort of manifested specifically on the left, both in the feeling of failure of having not anticipated this current stage of whatever hellscape we're in, or feeling impotent to do anything different about it. So I guess obviously Occupy started a conversation about class. but that sort of got petered out. Sort of techno-utopian hopes that like social media would like cause a revolution kind of died out. And I guess for me, at least, someone who sort of summed up this malaise really well is Mark Fisher in Capitalist Realism, which is the sort of about this phrase which weirdly is attributed to both Zizek and Frederick Jameson, which is that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And for Fisher, this has sort of two causes. The first is post-Fordism, which just makes life a lot more miserable for a lot of people, and then postmodernism, whose claims that nothing new can happen, also means that change from post-Fordist shittiness is therefore impossible.
And so another thing to keep in mind for like the Jackass revisitation is that a lot of, like this guy in the red, he died in a drunk driving accident, and then soon after, Bam Margera developed like a horrible drinking problem and just became a hermit. And he's only recently started coming out and doing press again. I'm not really sure what the goal of the press is, but he's like on Instagram, taking photos from Machu Picchu and stuff, doing interviews on TV. He's had his dog, he's trying to skateboard again. One of the other people like had to go to rehab for heroin addiction. Guy Don Vito was charged with like pedophilia, basically. Like it's like it really, so Jackass like had a really intense wake left a really intense wake. But so now looking back at the show itself, it is this kind of like strikingly acute example of what Mark Fisher calls capitalist realism. This idea that like capitalist social relations are all that are really possible, like there's nothing else. And it's also this like severely Ballardian imagery as well. And so thinking about it in the Bush years, Patricia Reed, who's like a xenofeminist writer, has talked about how in recent decades, battles over the good life as an apparatus of social cohesion are waged less in hopes of territorial expansion and more in relation to the occupation of cognitive territory. So along the lines of neopolitics, soft power, and control of information networks. At the time of Jackass's production, George Bush's invasion of Iraq acted as a timely reminder that the old models of empire were failing unequivocally. Jackass exemplifies the sheer nonsense that underpins empire at this moment. The principle of cognitive dissonance is embodied materially in the most literal base sense. Looking at the settings of where the show and the 3 feature films took place, it's always in like endless empty space, like true junk space, like racing shopping carts through empty parking lots, like these weird lakes, like man-made lakes in the middle of nowhere. And it's hard, it looks like this kind of like post-apocalyptic setting, which also coincides with this strange timing. The end of history was supposed to happen in 1989. And then there are these people just doing what they're doing on camera. Another interesting aspect of this kind of like milieu of abjection is that the Miller Brewing Company sponsored the first Jackass film, which adds another layer of intensity to the whole thing when you consider like Ryan Dunn's death. And so that kind of leads us to this theme of self-destruction in Jackass, which was really weird at the time, because I remember like parents had to urge their kids not to do these things, but like kids wanted to. So it's kind of like contagious, like self-destruction thing that it initiated and sort of circulated. It's definitely like a kind of like body horror, but also body humor. It's like they're sculptors using their own bodies as material. Here's a Jeff Tremaine quote, who's the Jackass director. And to me, it kind of links up to how, through so much negativity that the show expresses, there's an odd kind of positivity that opens up. He says, "You get to vicariously beat up your dad through Bam and this loving mom and this funny, chaotic world. When they were brainstorming things to film, they'd say, what's something somebody's never seen? Another way of thinking about what they would do on camera is like trying to get rid of themselves in like a really like materialist sense. Like something like opening up oneself to non-human forces of empire's materials, golf courses, man-made lakes, suburban parking lots, and like brushing up against non-anthropomorphic forces. There's a kind of funny resonance with strategies of like John Cage or Xenakis or Stockhausen trying to reduce the agentic force of the human, because it's like they are getting rid of their agency in like a really temporary, like, it's like not, it's not a long-term project, but while they're doing the stunt, it's happening. There's a Deleuze quote from 1985 about extreme sports, and it's pretty interesting to think about this kind of like removal of the self. He says, all the new sports, surfing, windsurfing, hang gliding, take the form of entering into an existing wave. There's no longer an origin as starting point, but a sort of putting into orbit. The key thing is how to get taken up in the motion of a big wave, a column of rising air, to get into something instead of being the origin of an effort. Jackass also recalls certain strains of like certain theoretical terms. For instance, like how do you pronounce tikkun?
Oh, tikkun.
Tikkun. There's this line from What Is to Be Done. I think it's on the first page. All at once, as if born of some underground region of civilization, appeared a whole counter world of subjectivities that no longer wanted to consume, that no longer wanted to produce, that no longer even wanted to be subjectivities. Relevant also is communization theory, which is premised on the idea that the ultimate goal of the proletariat should be self-abolition and not self-realization, as Marx would suggest. Also in Lie's journal, Sky Palaces called for the abolition of all identity categories, arguing that identities are the names of real material processes of capitalism, not of something essential or salvageable within us. There's a very material texture to the idea of self-abolition exploring these ideas, which obviously has almost nothing to do with Jackass, but that nonetheless Jackass sort of indexes in this unintentional but deeply strange way. Also, we can think of like eschatology, just like a kind of recurring theoretical thing, just like the end of the world. It's kind of like bacchanalia, but like not at all. Like it doesn't even seem like they're having fun. Yeah. Another thing to think about is like Sex Pistols, No Future. Don't be told what you want. Don't be told what you need. There's no future. There's no future. There's no future for you. Just like neoliberal capitalism, but also this. Also another thing to think about is the legacy of counterculture, because like skate culture, rock and roll culture, like the Jackass theme song is a Husker Du song, which was like a canonical punk band or whatever. Like, so they're taking from these like countercultural traditions, but they're not really doing anything like remotely transgressive, or like the only transgressive thing that they're doing is hurting themselves. Yeah, like there's no like it's not really transgressive for them to associate themselves with like trash or debris. Like, it's like business as usual. And all this kind of leads into what for us became a conversation about like the category of the human and how that gets really messy.
Yeah, I guess the one other thing I would add to what Alex just said is that about countercultures is that this was airing on MTV, so it was sort of like right at the time when a lot of countercultural scenes from the 80s and 90s were now being like sponsored and encouraged by the forces that they had been like at least trying to resist before that. So it's almost like they're repeating the gestures of those earlier movements, but without as much of like the belief or the power and so just sort of doing it as a joke.
But it's like more addictive than ever.
Exactly, yeah. And it's weird. And yeah, I guess these sort of themes of self-erasure have been, and white impotence have been addressed in queer theory. I guess like the thing I would say before going into that is that Jackass doesn't have like intentional theoretical aims. So we're not trying to like do a call out of Jackass or something, because it's not really trying to do those things. Anyway, there have been some good queer theory critiques actually of Jackass. So we drew heavily from this piece called MTV's Jackass: Transgression, Abjection, and the Economy of White Masculinity by Sean Brayton. Brayton talks a lot about, he defines the abject as, glossing Kristeva, as the jettisoned object which is radically excluded and draws me toward the place where meaning collapses. So he says the carnivalesque sort of ambiance in Jackass is actually indebted to the male rectum, taking society's anxieties about disorderliness, decay, and corruption, and placing them center stage. Moreover, the film centralizes rather than conceals the inherent homoerotic contradictions within the supposed heterosexual bastion of athletics. And I guess the most famous explicit butt reference is the butt chug sketch, where all of the beer ends up coming out of his butt. Sorry, this always just cracks me up. Alex put in the notes, he looks like his life flashed before his eyes or something, dazed, like he had just pulled out of a car wreck. And I guess for us, Brayton's biggest point was the way usually, like, white people, and in this case white men, sort of use this abject identity to sort of shirk off accountability for other things, like other intense privileges they have. So in Brayton's world, the espousal of an abject identity ironically works to restore the cultural importance of the white male subject. Self-derogation functions to erect a safe perimeter around the self, making the white male impervious to criticism. So for Brayton, the irony is like the act of like destroying yourself actually is like a reification of yourself, and that's part of like the spectacle that you see in Jackass. Sort of like, yeah, I guess that. So Lee Edelman, who's like a very, I guess, like famous queer theorist, white man queer theorist from the aughts. I guess it, like, I have like my, I don't know, things I don't like about him, but I guess like it's important to preface that by saying that like he did sort of come of age during the 80s, and 90s, which is when AIDS was happening. So it is like, I guess like these themes of like self-erasure and destruction were also like super personally real to him as well. So he wrote a lot about, basically he sort of picked up Freud's theme of the death drive, which is that people just want to fundamentally destroy themselves, and just said, well, that's gay. And his sort of famous book, No Future, Queer Theory and the Death Drive, which was actually published around the same time as Jackass in 2004, argues that Western politics are future-oriented based on the possible well-being of the unborn child, whose innocence and happiness becomes worth any present-day sacrifice. So in contrast to this, Edelman says that gayness is a death drive, the negativity opposed to every form of social viability, including any form of futurity. So whereas like straight culture is all about the future, like get a mortgage, get a family, queer culture is like anti-future, like just destroy yourself in whatever this is. So queer theorists such as Jack Halberstam and Robert James have applied Edelman's analyses to various artworks that seem to refuse this future-oriented social order via self-destruction. So in From No Future to Delete Yourself, You Have No Chance to Win, James describes Atari Teenage Riot, whose music, she argues, is from and for neoliberalism's losers, those who, thanks to their position and or lack of charisma and talent, are bad at competing under capitalism, which in turn diverted resources away from this now surplus population, which was useless to it. If, to quote, delete yourself, life was, quote, like a video game with no chance to win, then gradual, calculated self-destruction became a form of queer refusal to replicate a productive subjectivity on which capitalism could feast. So yeah, I guess like we sort of felt like there are really real reasons why people both like wanted to erase themselves and felt like they were being erased. But we also felt like Edelman and James and Halberstam are sort of making a lot of assumptions about what it means to have a self that you can erase in the first place, and we felt like the biggest critique of that had come from Black studies, especially from scholars like Hortense Spillers, Sadia Hartman, and Frank Wilderson.
Yeah, so it's like basically our main point, and this is like not really original, just like following their scholarship, is you can't really posit like this universal rejection of futurity as like liberatory, because not everyone has access to futurity in the same way, for obvious reasons. Sadia Hartman writes about the afterlife of slavery, and how Black people are fundamentally excluded from the ontological status of the human. Slavery is what enabled capitalism to begin in the first place, and these structures persist in the conditions of social death that Black people are subjected to. In this line of thinking, Blackness is not an identity conceivable in traditional humanist terms, which is how somebody like Edelman is thinking, but it is conceived of by like white civil society as an accumulated, expendable commodity produced by gratuitous violence. It is important to understand, following Frank Wilderson, the distinction between that position on the one hand and that of an exploited or alienated subject, which you might read about in Marxism or something like that. Edelman and other theorists of queer negativity are premising their work on notions of liberation achieved by a human difference, which does not hold up to close scrutiny when considered from the points of view that we're discussing. Afro-pessimists such as Jared Sexton and Frank Wilderson argue that Blackness is a position of non-ontology or non-being, historically characterized by fungibility, which structurally is excluded, thus shoring up the inviolable individuality of humans. Here's Calvin Warren. There's no way to eliminate differentiating violence without eliminating the human, since both are mutually constitutive and coterminous. And then here's a Wilderson quote. Blackness is a position of structural non-communicability in the face of all other positions.
Yeah, so I guess from that, I guess one of our arguments too is that if you're non-Black, then you can't actually like destroy yourself without killing yourself. Like it's not symbolically possible, and that the sort of spectacle of Jackass is like the sort of like spectacle of this impossibility. Like they are sort of like ostensibly trying as hard as they can to sort of like delete themselves, I guess, to quote Atari Teenage Riot, but they obviously can't do it. And so considering the themes of substance abuse and absurdity, it felt only fitting to us to end with the stoner bro philosophy of Francois Laurel. So he's like 85, so he doesn't probably smoke weed, but his writings, which are about what he calls oneness, feel like the kind of philosophical musings you, like, I don't know, you're like, have when you're high. Laurel's project is a critique of philosophy, and basically his thing is that philosophy is like really narcissistic. It thinks it can kind of like split itself off from the world and then analyze the world from a sort of like separate objective position, and that this is like kind of fucked up because it turns the world into an object that purely exists for philosophical observation. And after splitting itself off from the world, Laurel thinks that then philosophy tries to then make itself part of a world, and that this is the kind of like dialectical movement you see from like Plato to Hegel to Marx and onwards. But this sort of like joining again is impossible because in order to exist, philosophy has to be separate from the world. So it sort of just ends up being a spiral.
His solution is oneness. And so this solution isn't really like about creating a different kind of philosophy, but instead abandoning philosophy without eventually employing it in order to deconstruct it. In full disclosure, Charlie knows more about Laurel than I do, so if you have questions about this,
No, you're doing good.
they're better to ask. His endeavor, he says, is to use philosophy as a material, as one would use space or color, as a materiality. For an art that would be of a piece with conceptual thought without making a new aesthetic or a new philosophy. As Alexander Galloway, who's a philosopher and media theorist, puts it about Laurel, what if philosophy is the problem, not the solution? What if the best response to philosophy is to cease doing it? Laurel is the most recent figure to take these questions seriously, but certainly not the first. The chief aim of his life's work is to consider philosophy without resorting to philosophy in order to do so. His chief aim was to think philosophy unphilosophically. And it's in this kind of tone, sort of like poetics, where Laurel starts to kind of sound like a caricature or something of like 60s counterculture, like hippie stuff, which led to 70s nihilism, which ultimately led to Jackass. Because his answer to philosophy is what he calls the generic, or the one.
Yeah, so I guess for Laurel, this splitting move that he says is like characteristic of philosophy is like characteristic of like how we understand everything. So the way we understand things is constantly by dividing in two. So his answer is that we should refuse to participate in this splitting, and that basically just means that we should just one. Instead of a two becoming one, there's just one. It's completely indivisible, and it's only because philosophy imagined it was different in the first place that it thought to split. So I guess for the consequences for philosophy is that instead of being kind of like above the world, analyzing it objectively, it's just part of the world, like they're all one. So to quote this Laurel scholar whose name I can't pronounce, the quote is, "All entities are equal, that is to say, in his language, they are equally one. To respond to this with the query, equally one what, is to miss the point." Laurel's democracy of thought also we felt something in common with Jackass's anti-high culture stance, in which high culture is pilloried by aggressive low culture, which is then subsumed back into high culture again, and it's materialism, in which human beings perform being pummeled into disparate molecules.
So, taking some of Laurel's provocations and bringing them back to the themes of self-destruction and subjectivity in Jackass. In response to a question like, what is the subject? Or can the subject, as represented in Jackass, or alternatively, the Edelman's theory of queer negativity, or alternatively, something like Tikkun, successfully can the subject successfully abolish itself? It seems like Laurel would say that he doesn't have an answer to these questions because he wouldn't ask them in the first place.
Yeah, I guess like, I guess if Jackass is asking like, can I destroy myself? Laurel's answer is like, that question doesn't even make sense. First, because the answer is obvious to him. The subject is one because everything is one. And second, because asking the question is a way of performing the sort of philosophical splitting move that he totally hates. So a Laurelian approach with its aim of critiquing philosophy would instead ask, what does it mean that philosophy is asking this question of what is the subject, can it destroy itself? What does philosophy hope to get out of it? And the answer to Laurel is further splitting in narcissism, and for scholars like Hortense Spiller and Frank Wilderson, it would be a way of sort of within a white Western tradition of trying to define itself and destroy itself without acknowledging its relation to blackness. So that's our talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Betsy. Thanks again, and Kimberly Clark. Appreciate it.
Just wine. Some more wine. Beer as well.